And joining us now is John Brennan, the former director of the Central Intelligence Agency, also the author of Undaunted, My Fight Against America's Enemies at Home and Abroad, now out in paperback, or out in paperback tomorrow, John, and it's a wonderful book, so highly recommended. Thank you for being with us. So after the thinly veiled nuclear threats by Putin, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said this to Chuck Todd on Meet the Press just yesterday.
Well, let me say it plainly. If Russia crosses this line, there will be catastrophic consequences for Russia. The United States will respond decisively.
So let's talk about what the possible consequences could be. We're told there have been private warnings to the Kremlin for months. Take us behind the scenes. Just how is this all being communicated, and what could we be saying to Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin?
Well, Andrea, first of all, our national security superstructure, I'm sure, has convened numerous times to talk about what the options might be in the event that Putin decides to employ some type of nuclear weapon, a tactical nuclear weapon on the battlefield. But also, I think we're having high-level discussions with our NATO allies, in particular, because they would have to also deal with the consequences of a nuclear use by Russia. But I'm sure that the messages that are being conveyed, as Jake said, have made it very clear to the Russians that there would be a highly consequential and also a catastrophic result as if they decide to choose to go the nuclear route. Now, I'm sure they're not giving the clear signals about exactly what it would involve, but it would be difficult for me to believe that it wouldn't involve some type of military action that we would take against Russia or Russian troops.
The president has been so clear, John, that he wants to avoid anything that becomes NATO versus Russia, that he is trying to avoid, for instance, Zelensky going beyond the border, with NATO-supplied, U.S.-supplied weapons to contain this and not have what he's calling World War III. How does that happen if Putin were to go nuclear?
Well, I think if Putin were to decide to go nuclear, it shows that he is then feeling that he is losing the war. It would be a desperate option, because I do not think that Vladimir Putin wants to tangle with the United States and NATO military forces, which are qualitatively far superior to Russia's forces, particularly in light of their poor performance. So I do think that it would raise the stakes significantly across the globe, in fact. And I do believe that the countries that have been supporting Russia to some extent so far, such as China and India, who have been recently expressing their concerns about what's happening in Ukraine, would quickly condemn any type of Russian nuclear use. So it would not just be the United States and NATO allies that would be opposed to this strike. I do think that there would be international outrage directed against Putin and Russia. But I do believe that the United States has already pulled together the key options that it will exercise. And I do believe that they will be decisive, and they will make sure that Russia understands that there is going to be no turning back from this. I do think that President Biden, as you pointed out, has tried to go up to the edge of confrontation with Russia, but not expanding the conflict at all. But if Putin were to go nuclear, I think he then would be making the decision to expand it well beyond Ukraine.
And President Putin has just granted citizenship to Edward Snowden. So what is more dangerous? Edward Snowden, now a Russian citizen with whatever knowledge he may have had already put out, or former President Donald Trump, who says he can declassify by just doing sort of a, Karnak the Magnificent and thinking that something is declassified?
Well, I think Edward Snowden, who has been traitorous since he left the United States several years ago, I'm sure he has shared with the Russians probably all that he already knows about U.S. intelligence. And Donald Trump continues to be in his own delusional world, and his followers, I think, are even more delusional than him, believing in some of the absurd things he says, as you point out, saying even if he thinks about declassifying something, it is a done deal. That is just totally absurd, and it just really underscores how reckless Donald Trump is and how irresponsible he is and how he never should have set foot in the White House. And I certainly hope we're never going to see a day like that again.
What does it say about the war that we're seeing such widespread protests now against the draft in Russia? It's really unprecedented.
Well, it is. I think things are going badly for Putin on multiple fronts. Certainly on the Ukrainian battlefield, as Aaron was pointing out, setback after setback in the Russian military. And on the international scene, as he is getting criticized by his erstwhile partners. But also, I think, and most worrisome from his perspective, is it's going badly domestically. He had to know there was going to be this opposition to this partial mobilization, and we've seen it now manifest itself in the streets of Russia. We also see that the economic problems in Russia are increasing as well. So I think Putin is feeling increasingly cornered, which is a worrisome development because as a cornered rat, he may opt for taking some steps that he would prefer to avoid. But if he sees that his fortunes are dwindling, and the fortunes of those around him, that's when I think we have to be very, very vigilant in terms of what else he might opt to do.
Can you imagine a scenario where Vladimir Putin uses tactical nuclear weapons and we respond with nuclear weapons?
Well, I think Putin has made some very bad miscalculations to date, going into Ukraine the way he did, and subsequent decisions. So I don't think we can take anything off the table at all. And I hope that he's not going to opt for the nuclear weapons. But if he does, if it is some type of tactical nuclear weapon on the battlefield of Ukraine, I do think that the U.S. and NATO will respond decisively. How they're going to do that, I will leave it to Putin to have to sort of guess on that one. But I certainly hope that we're not going to see some type of nuclear exchange with Russia. I do hope that there will be sensible people, including in the Kremlin, that will stop Putin from doing something like that, which will ensure the destruction, I think, of the Russian state, and certainly of the current Russian leadership.
When you say within the Kremlin, that is very telling indeed, because that is regime change.
I think there are a lot of folks around Putin who believe that they are in the same accountability bucket as he is, but I am hoping that someone is going to see that Russia is on a downward spiral, and they need to stop this downward spiral before it does become catastrophic for them, because that's the direction that it's heading right now.
John Brennan, thank you. And John Brennan's book, Undaunted, My Fight Against America's Enemies at Home and Abroad, is out in paperback tomorrow.